We're going to go ahead and get started. I call the meeting to order. For Mitch. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember those members who have passed before our last meeting. All right, thank you. All right, I turn it over to Steve.
All right. Last year, one of the things that the board asked for strategic planning was a discussion of long-term risks to the plan. And Jacob and Mitch, if you want to go ahead and come on up. The style of the presentation today is a little bit different than what you're used to. So instead of the guys sitting behind the desk and behind the screen, they're going to be right out here. And what we wanted to do, what we wanted to do for you guys is give you sort of a peek behind the curtain, if you will, in terms of how we work with the actuary's office when we're talking about the kind of stuff that to prepare the materials and so forth for this meeting. So this is Jacob and Mitch having a conversation about long-term risk to the plan. And there's also going to be some short-term risk to the plan as part of this. There are slides. You don't have to worry about taking notes. We're going to hand the slides out to you a little bit later this morning so that you don't have to worry about writing any of this stuff down. And then, although it's a conversation between the two of them, the idea is you guys can insert yourself, ask questions, join the discussion at any time. Yes, get over that initial moment of awkwardness as it starts off and sort of get into it. With that, I'll turn it over to you guys to take it from here.
Okay, we're also adding technology. So is the microphone working? It is. Okay, good.
Let's check mine real quick. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Excellent.
Okay, and Steve left out, we are hoping that it's not just a conversation between the two of us, but with all of you too. We'd really appreciate that if you jump in and ask questions, and feel free to take over. I didn't realize I was up here, but I was telling Steve before that I'm having flashbacks to high school football of a drill we did called Bull in the Ring, where you got in the middle and then the coach yelled someone's name and they came at you. So hopefully it doesn't turn into that. And me and Mitch were also joking that, a peek behind the curtain, the excitement. Steve has assured us that all of you would be excited to get to hear the conversations between a pension attorney and an actuary. So
high on everybody's wish list, I'm sure.
Not oversold that to us, your excitement level. Yes. Yes, and we'll try to keep it more PG than our usual heated actuary and attorney discussions we have. Okay, so Steve set it up pretty well with kind of the subject matter of the presentation. So we'll let Mitch go to the first slide.
Yeah, before we go to, just like Jacob said, want you guys to be part of the conversation, ask questions, but also comments are fine too. We're going to be looking at some history of some funded ratio and contribution rates. And there is a lot of great experience on this board. So if you want to share some of the things that have made Left2 successful, I think that would be a great addition to this conversation as well. So it doesn't all have to just be questions for me. Actually, I'd appreciate if it's not just questions for me. All right. So we're going to start off with a big measure. Going to start off with a projection of funded ratio. So this is a measure we look at quite a bit. Funded ratio, funded status. Those are both synonymous. I just called it funded ratio here. So in this table, or in this chart, what I have is historical funded ratio, as well as our most recent and updated projection of funded ratio. And a quick reminder for Jacob, I'm sure everybody else knows this, what funded ratio is: comparing the earned benefits of the plan at a specific point in time with the assets of the plan, the actuarial value of assets. It's a point in time measurement, so it changes over time, and it's considered a measure of plan health because funded status can tell you if the plan is on track with its funding goals. So in general, plan with 100% funded status or higher is generally on track with its funding goals. And that's exactly what we see in this chart, both all of the history and all of the projection over 100%.
And then just a quick reminder, I know we talked about this earlier in the year, but what were the kind of main causes? You know, great being up there at 113% looks great. And then what were the causes of going down to 102%? Some of the main causes of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good segue. We can just take a look at the history portion of this graph. That's on the left portion in the solid line. The projection is in the dashed line. The highest funded status that we saw was 113%. There was the decrease in 2021. Decrease happened for a few reasons. Benefit improvement bill passed. That's reflected in funded status immediately. Also, plan assumptions are reflected in funded status. The board reduced the rate of return assumption from 7.4 to 7%. That was based on Matt's recommendation. But on the positive side of that was the really large investment return of 2021, north of 31%. So huge investment return, but that investment gain is recognized in funded status over time due to asset smoothing. So that's recognized over an 8-year period. So the first two items, the change in assumptions and the benefit improvement, hit funded status or funded ratio immediately, and then the positive investment return is recognized slowly. So we see this decrease, but then you can see it in the projection as well, as some of that return is being recognized in future years as well. In 2022 and 2023, decreases in funded ratio were from higher than expected salary changes and some inflation changes as well. So now we get to the good part. That's where we are right now, 102%. And if this projection is accurate, that would be hopefully the low point of funded ratio, because our projection is showing increases in funded ratio. To make this projection, let me talk about this briefly. We have a model that essentially estimates what future valuations could be. So you heard our valuation presentation this last summer, the 2023 valuation. We then have a model that then estimates future valuations, and that's what we're seeing in this dashed line here, estimates of what that could be in the future. We're making that big assumption that all future plan experience exactly equals the current plan assumptions. We know that's not going to happen, but this can give us a good baseline projection of where the plan could be headed. So what we see is good news. Increases in funded ratio. We're seeing increases to about 108%. And then if I were to extend this graph further out, it stays right at about 108%, which, again, good news. Not a forever increasing funded ratio, and not a funded ratio that goes up and then dives as well. This board adjusted your minimum rate funding policy to avoid the forever increasing funded ratio scenario, and it's occurring. According to these projections, that's what would occur. I'm going to stress that it's absolutely not going to happen exactly like this, but this gives us an idea of where the plan is trending.
I feel like I shouldn't ask this question, but it does look like is it just me, or is it trending slightly down over time in projections?
It does dip. It does kind of wiggle around just a little bit, and that's a feature of kind of how we do some of the modeling, but it stays right in that 108, plus or minus maybe 0.25%. And then I will point out the 105.5%. That's a blue number highlighted because that number is really important. That is our projection for the funded ratio in the upcoming rate setting valuation. So the 2023 valuation was your last rate setting valuation. The 2025 is the next rate setting valuation. With the results of that valuation, you could choose to update contribution rates if you want to. And the good news is that that funded ratio is over 105%. That's important because of those tiers of the minimum rate policy. The minimum rate policy 105 to 110, that's that next tier that reduces contribution rates. I shared back in June that our preliminary projections were not showing this funded ratio above 105%. It was still 104%. Now it's over 105%, and it's over because this projection includes the 2024 investment return. We didn't know what the 2024 investment return was back in June. We do now, and that investment return was about 8%. So about 1% higher than the assumed return. And that 1% higher assumed return pushes that funded ratio above 105%. That's good news, but also demonstrates just how touchy this can be in terms of moving above or below that 105% trigger. So there's going to be a lot of experience that's still going to happen. There's going to be another year of investment experience. There's going to be 2 more years of plan experience that we're going to include to get to that 2025 valuation. But at least having the 2024 return over the assumed return is a step in the right direction.
Mr. Chair, can I jump in with a question? So you used a really interesting term there. You said it's touchy. It's very sensitive. That sensitivity of this particular plan to investment returns, is that significantly greater than other plans in general, or is it normal?
Yeah, good question. So I used touchy in regard to exceeding or falling below the 105% trigger of breaking point between the first tier or the second tier of funded status. In terms of kind of stepping back and answering your question, is LEF 2 more sensitive to investment risk or investment volatility than other plans? I don't believe so. I don't believe there's any reason that LEF 2 would be, say, more sensitive than PERS or TERS or other plans. But to kind of digging into that stuff can show things that I wouldn't expect. But at first blush, I would say LEF 2 doesn't have anything unique in terms of its investment volatility.
Yeah, and I say that's kind of my understanding is that the board's chosen rate stability as a goal, which the funding policy and method keeps that pretty consistent unless you hit these tiers, and then there can be a significant drop or increase in the rate. But then also the board still does have the option, and that's kind of what I was thinking looking at this is just how. So this is assuming that the board adopts the rate that's in the rate funding policy. And then this last rate setting, the board did not do that, in part because of seeing how it was supposed to go up and then back down, and instead chose to put more weight on the rate stability moving forward. But just interesting seeing, how close the board would be to the tipping point there at the 105%, and how the contribution rate that they adopt could impact that when you're that close to one of those big steps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, that what comes out of the valuation according to the policy, that's what we're going to calculate. And that's what then I'm going to present that to you, and you're going to see those results. But this last year was a great example of the board receiving that information and then making a decision that fit your goals with the results of that valuation. So by no means are you tied to, oh my goodness, it's 104.9, now rates have to go up. You get to make that decision still with each rate adoption cycle.
Mr. Chair. That's kind of rhetorical, but looking at what we have in the way of LEF 2 and where our funding ratios are compared to nationwide, what is the historical rate of funding in most pension funds?
Yeah, I don't know that off the top of my off the top of my head. I spend all day in Washington state pension plans, but not the nationwide.
Well, one of the things I can tell you is the board is a member of NASRA,
Mhm.
National Association of State Retirement Administrators, and they do an annual survey
Mhm.
of all public pension plans. And since the inception of the board, and particularly since about 2008, when the board's rate stability policy went into place, the board has been one of the top 5 plans in the country every year, sometimes the best, in terms of funded status. And similarly, since about that time, the board has also received an award for excellence in funding policy. Just recently received it again for this year. That was spoiler, I guess, for one of the items in my November admin update. But you guys have done an extraordinary job compared to not only just other plans in the state in terms of stability and funded status. Washington in general is one of the most successful states in the entire country.
That's pretty much what I was getting at, because I remember I thought a well-funded plan was 80%, was considered 80%. And, I always look at these charts and I get worried sometimes because people think it's so successful that we there's 2 ways of looking at it. People start shooting at us. And one of the things that I was looking at, and Jacob, you mentioned it, you see there's a slight dip at a point over there, but by that time, this board would adjust. And I think that's the biggest thing we got going, because we say the return rate's going to be we think it's 7%. And as you say, it goes to 8%. If it goes down to 15%, but there's a smoothing to this. So we're not chasing the numbers. And I think that was one of the things that because of this, and I'm not saying we're the smartest guys in the world or people in the world, but one of the things we saw back in the 90s, that we were doing the roller coaster and we were chasing the numbers back then. And that's when everybody was panicked. And sometimes, the people that sit here have been able to adjust our figures so they look well, they look good. But people look at that 108 or 105 and say, well, you got way too much money, and try and stick their fingers into it. And this board, because of this legislature allowing us to continue, we've been able to stabilize our rates and and the contribution rates for a long period of time. And I think through Steve and the staff that we have here, and also the actuary working with us, we've done a great job on holding the numbers. And sometimes we have to make adjustments that maybe somebody's not going to like, but we're able to do it because we agree that stabilized funding is what this needs. So I think you guys have done a great job. And I was just being rhetorical on the other one. I knew what it was.
Well, and Pat, you touched on something in terms of a long-term risk to the plan, that, outside parties looking at the board and saying, oh, you guys have been doing a great job. Let me give you some ideas about how you can do an even greater job. That has historically been one of the challenges. Now, I will say this, probably since 2014, maybe, some of that has dropped off. And so I mentioned this a couple years ago, and I want to mention it to you guys again as you're talking about long-term challenges. Your stable rate funding policy went into effect in 2008. Since that time, you have weathered the market crash of 2008, 2009. You have weathered the longest sustained run-up in market history, topped off with a 30% investment return. You've had more conservative actuarial assumptions adopted numerous times, and you've had a significant benefit improvement. And all that time, your contribution rates have remained within a band of 20 to 30 basis points. which over, again, this is a 16-year period with some extraordinary challenges of both upward and downward pressure. And the plan has remained solidly funded and the rates have remained remarkably stable. So you guys, I'd say that one as a kudos to some of the decisions that you've made and past boards have made, but also as a encouragement as you face some of these other challenges for the future, that if you've already handled 2008 and 2009 and significant benefit improvements, both good and positive news and bad news, you guys can handle the challenges you've got in the future as well. You should be encouraged that you'll be able to, I should say. All right.
Speaking of contribution rates, here's your contribution rates. Same setup in this graph as the last graph. We have historical rates on the left in the solid line, and we have the projected rates on the right in the dashed line. Yeah, and Steve sort of stole my thunder on this, but I didn't want to stop you. It sounded really good. This is how stable these rates have been since I just have till 2015 on here, but a pretty remarkable period of stable contribution rates speaks directly towards the board's goal of stable contribution rates. We saw on the last slide how much movement we can see in funded ratio year over year, where these contribution rates have remained pretty stable. I am showing just member contribution rates up here. Obviously, employers and the state contribute as well, 60 and 40% respectively, but I'm just showing member contribution rates for simplicity. So where do we project that these rates could be headed? Well, it's a little bit of good news on the horizon, at least according to these projections, is that we project that rates could come down to about the 8.35% area. Quick note on what I did for this analysis. The board has adopted rates for 2028 and 2029 using the 4-year rate adoption policy. For this analysis, I let our model estimate those rates for 2028 and 2029 based on our projection of the 2025 valuation. That's that 105.5% we saw on the last slide. You don't have to adjust those adopted rates if you don't want to. I just wanted you to see what those projected rates could be, and according to this projection, you would have the option to lower rates according to your minimum rate policy if you so choose. So that's why that 8.33 is in blue. It ties to the blue 105.5% funded status on the prior slide. And then projecting rates out here a little further, rates will be projected to stay about in the same area.
So it was great that rates that the investment board did well this last year, but what could impact that? Just 1 year of good investment returns had that impact. So what I guess risk are there of kind of doing away with those returns quickly and not seeing these projections play out?
Yeah, definitely, and we're gonna talk about a bunch of that in more detail here. Investment risk, that's obviously a big one, lower than assumed investment returns. We've seen some salary experience that has increased plan costs as well. Really, any of the big ones are probably salary experience, investment experience, retirement experience. If members retire at much larger or faster rates than we assume, that could increase plan costs as well. So all of that none of these are also going to occur in isolation. It's not like everything else is going to happen, but investments are going to go down. If investments go down, some of the other plan experience could fall on the other side and offset some of that. So it's helpful to think about these risks in isolation, but in actuality, that's definitely not how they occur, which is why we still do annual valuations, even off-cycle valuations that aren't used for rate setting, so we can stay on top of plan risks as they emerge.
I think you mentioned this earlier, but the asset smoothing from the big return year the investment board had a couple of years ago. How much longer is that being smoothed out over?
So I believe that will be fully recognized by 2028. So it was a 8-year smoothing because it fell on the absolute bookends of the smoothing policy. A reminder of how the smoothing policy works: it smooths 1 year, 1 additional year for every 1% the actual return differs from the assumed return. So 7% is the return, 15% would be where you would hit the 8-year smoothing. 31%, a lot bigger than 15, so you're going to get an 8-year smoothing on there, which is why we see it back to the funded ratio, that step up in funded ratio right through 2028. You can see that funded ratio recognizing those past deferred assets. I'm glad I got 2028 right. I was thinking it might be 2029 for a second. So yes, 2028. So Jacob kind of teed it up, but yeah, let's move from our baseline projections and talk a little bit about risk. I have 2 text slides today. This is the first one. There's another one after this. Bear with me on this. I put this in text because I think it's important to just put these definitions in front of us, talking about risk in actuarial measurements. And I want to define risk from an actuary's perspective. What does risk mean to me? Risk is when future plan experience differs from assumed plan experience. So those things that we were talking about before, investment returns, salary experience, retirement experience, there are hundreds of assumptions that we make, and we call risk when that actual plan experience differs from assumed plan experience. That generally happens every year. We're never perfectly accurate with our assumptions, so we're typically focusing on risks that have, when they occur, a material impact in the financial position of the plan. So yeah, this definition of risk is really broad, but we try to limit it to the most material risks that can start to alter these projections. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I was curious on this one, I'm not going to call it any individual, but I was just curious from honestly, from a member or employer perspective of what risk you see, especially it feels like on the law enforcement side that there's just been a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. And, from the pension side, policy side, we hear more about issues with recruitment and retention. And I was just, if anyone wants to talk about that, I think that bringing that risk instead of just the actuarial risk, but kind of what you're seeing out there and what you think might be happening.
Sure. Right now for LE, it's staffing. So Washington State, right, historically has been the lowest staffed law enforcement state in the United States. So there is a kind of a long-standing practice, albeit not a great practice to that. And I don't know what the exact numbers are based on the past with the numbers we have, and then those numbers ebbing and flowing consistently. Because obviously, as people retire, we need people to come into the plan and pay, right? So moving forward, that's a huge issue for us right now, because in addition to being consistently the lowest staffed, we are now at the lowest points historically we've seen in the state of Washington. So an example, I was hired in 2004. We have less deputies on duty today than we did in 2004. So for me, like I knew we were talking this today, I was reviewing this last night. I'm like, that's a huge risk from my perspective. Staffing, which is somewhat outside the scope of your guys' control, right? Again, you have to look at that, but it's kind of a nebulous item, right? Because it's like, how do you control that? Well, you really can't, right? That's agencies, right? Cities and counties have to decide how they're going to manage that. They're either going to hire people, right, or they don't, one way or the other. But I'd be interested in a perspective of how do you, in your world, how do you mitigate that, or how do you, I guess, plan the best for that when it's like you could say, well, sure, in the next 6 months there's going to be thousands of new hires, potentially, or potentially not, right? So that's something that I kind of had my noggin for today, as far as like, how do we get around that?
Can I just add to that as you answer that? So there's kind of where we are with hiring, and then there's where we are with kind of workers' comp and PTSD claims, for police and fire. And cities and unions and others having to kind of negotiate and deal with that, and potentially people leaving the profession because of those impacts of long-term PTSD that we really hadn't considered heavily in the past, but are really dealing with now. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's all related to the impacts on the workforce.
Well, I can share briefly from the actuarial perspective about new hires coming into the plan. When we do an annual valuation, we are looking at just the current population. And the calculation of contribution rates is just for that current population. So we are not setting an assumption for new hires coming into the plan and paying for current member benefits. So that's good news, is that from the pension side of things, if there are fewer new hires in the future, that should not significantly impact our baseline projection, because because the plan is well funded, it is on track with its funding. This board has adopted contribution rates that have fully funded member benefits as they've been earned. So future members coming in aren't coming in and being asked to subsidize past member benefits. And that's a great spot. That's exactly where you want to be as a pension plan.
So, and then I would think one of the potential consequences of if you're not able to recruit new people into the profession as quickly as you need them, that you end up with a older workforce and probably working a lot more overtime, which I feel like we hear a lot from fire and police right now. And so how do those things impact the pension plan?
Well, they could impact it probably primarily through higher than expected salary gains. And I think we've seen that over the last couple years. If members are working more overtime, all of that is pensionable. When members work longer and when members have larger salary gains than the current plan assumptions, that applies to all of their earned past service. So that can be a driver of increases in plan costs. We've seen that over the last couple years where there was some higher than anticipated salary gains, and then that impacted the liabilities of the plan.
But we don't know that's just overtime. Overtime might be a component of it, but we don't actually get the data on overtime, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
We just know that salaries went up larger than we anticipated. We have no data to indicate exactly what buckets of compensation those are coming from.
We always wish the actuaries had more data, and they always wish they had more data.
One of the questions that's come up in the past too related to this is, as members they're working a lot of mandatory overtime now. So as they're forced to work more hours and for longer periods of time, and potentially also older workers being forced to work mandatory overtime, do you guys track how that might impact like increased L&I claims or increased duty disability retirements as a result of this demand?
Yeah, really good question. And that goes to one of the bolded items up here on my slide, demographic risk. We set a pile of demographic assumptions about the incidences of disability benefits, members exiting active service and earning a disability benefit. And we study those assumptions in detail every 6 years. We compile decades of data and we look at it and we update the demographic assumptions for the plans. We are in the process of doing that right now, and we are going to have updated demographic assumptions for the board to review next year. So in terms of what we are seeing in more recent data, in terms of like what you mentioned, incidences of disability, we'll be able to answer that in a lot more detail next year. Sitting here right now, we haven't completed that study, and so I'm not really sure, but I think it stands to reason we could see increases in rates.
So do you peg your assumptions on merely the exit of people early based on those things? Do you have information about the level of PTSD or what caused those people to retire early? If it was an occupational cancer, for example, or death,
Yeah.
results from those things now?
Yeah, really good question. So there is a long-term nature to a lot of this stuff, and sometimes a duty death isn't recorded until 6 years after some sort of incidents occur. So you're exactly right. How the heck do you include that into your assumptions? And this is where it's a mix of data that we've observed and expectations, the mix of art and science. When some of the legislation that passed that expanded occupational diseases and cancers and things like that, we adjusted our assumption for expectations of increases in those sort of claims. Some of that legislation happened a few years ago, so hopefully now we'll have some of that data built into the experience study that we're looking at, and so we can see if we were right or if we were wrong. But because of the long-term nature of some of this stuff, you really can't get away from having it be a mix of what you've observed and expectations until we're 10, 20 years down the road and really have a lot of robust data. But where we stand right now, we don't. And so having to try to mix those two is what we do to set our assumptions. And which is why it's important to review assumptions, which is why it's important to, on set and scheduled cycles, to review all of the new data available and see if adjustments to those assumptions are necessary. All right. So yeah, just going through. So I talked about risk, and thank you all for sharing some perspectives of risk. Some of the key risks in Washington state pension plans. We covered these just a little bit, but let me just talk through them briefly. Demographic and economic risk. Demographic risk, things like mortality, retirement rates, disability rates, economic, salary growth, inflation, and then investment risk. That's the other big one, actual investment returns differing from assumed investment returns. That obviously happens quite a bit. Investment risk, and actually all of these risks, there are two sides to these risks. We tend to, and as actuaries, focus on the downsides of these risks. What happens if investment returns are 3% or 0%? But there is upside risk as well. There is risk that contribution rates to the plan could be overfunding because there is upside risk that could happen in the future as well. So I will generally be focusing on most of the downside scenarios here, but I just wanted to put out there that there is upside in all of these things, because my definition of risk is as simple as future plan experience differing from assumed plan experience. I didn't say it's differing to the downside. It could differ to the upside as well. Comments, questions on that before I move on?
I think that's good.
Okay.
See the charts.
Okay.
We got more text.
Oh, you got one more text slide. Sorry about that. So plan maturity. Steve's been bugging me about plan maturity for years, so I thought I'd finally get this one out here. I did not mention plan maturity as a pension plan risk, and that's because it's not technically a pension plan risk. First of all, what am I talking about with plan maturity? With plan maturity, we're talking about where a pension plan is on its life cycle. On one far end, we have a brand new plan, all active members. On the other end, you have everybody is a retiree. There's no active members at all. That is not in and of itself a risk. It is better to think about plan maturity as a plan feature, where a plan is on the continuum of plan maturity, because that helps explain how that plan is going to react to certain plan risks. So my examples, if we think about a plan like LEF1, there is about 10 active members left. Everybody else is retired. If there is salary risk, where salary growth is different than our assumptions, that's not going to matter very much. There's 10 members, has barely any impact at all. But investment return volatility is going to have a lot bigger difference on that plan because that plan has accumulated all the plan assets that it's going to accumulate. It has a very small contribution base to levy any contributions over. So very different impact for a highly mature plan like LEF 1. On the very other end of the spectrum, super low maturity, brand new plan, everybody's active, only has a couple years of service. There's not very many assets accumulated. If investment experience is different than we assume, there's a lot of time to make that up. And the pot that investment experience is impacting isn't very big. But salary experience, yeah, those guys, salary experience for an entire active, if the entire plan membership is active, salary experience is going to have a lot bigger impact there. So yes, plan maturity, important, not a risk, and it helps us understand how a plan is going to react to certain risks.
So maybe I missed you saying this, but is LEF 2 a mature plan? Is there an actuarial definition of a plan being mature or just a sliding scale?
He didn't tell me he was going to ask this, but I knew he was going to ask this. The answer is no, that there is not a precise definition that says now LEF 2 is mature or over here it wasn't mature and over here it is mature. There's no precise definition of that. There is just sort of the continuum. What we do look at is plan maturity metrics to help us understand where a plan is in its maturity. So we have 3 plan maturity metrics here: liability ratio, headcount ratio, cash flow ratio. Jacob, dealer's choice, which one do you want to talk about first?
There's a lot going on this, and cash flow sounds the scariest, so let's save that for last. And if you could, just explain a bit about liability ratio. It doesn't look very exciting, honestly. So, but what is that showing us?
Okay, yeah, I'll just breeze through this slide quickly. It's on the same setup as our prior slides: history on the left, projections on the right. Liability ratio, exactly what it sounds like. You're taking the annuitant liability, dividing it by the total liability, giving you a sense for how much of the total plan liability is held by annuitants. Ours are teeny tiny. Apologize for that, because the maximum this value could be is a 1. But back in 2010, teeny tiny amount. And as we step forward through that history, we do see those blue bars get bigger. Not surprising. That would tell us that LEF 2 has been maturing over this 20-year period. And then on the projected side of things, we do see those blue bars continue to grow, but the growth in those blue bars is a lot smaller as we start stepping out on the projected side. And that's because LEF 2 is an open plan. LEF 2 is obviously open to new hires. The system is growing. When members retire, they are ideally replaced by new hires. So the most extreme cases of plan maturity, like LEF 1, where everybody's retired and there's no active members, that's off the table for LEF 2 because it is an open plan. And what we specifically see in these projections is that there comes this point to where plan maturity has sort of reached its ultimate value. The plan is sort of done maturing. It has sort of reached this state where the maturing part is over. We see the maturing part happen 2010 to 2022 here, but in that projection, that process slows and eventually stabilizes.
So is this what you would expect to see is there anything that sticks out for LEF 2 compared to I know you said you don't look at other states a lot, but is there anything unexpected here, or is this just kind of normal aging process of the plan?
This is what we're seeing in a lot of our other open plans for the state retirement systems: PERS, TERS, SERS. All of those plans opened around the same time. So we're seeing a similar process of maturity happen in those plans as well.
The issue that Jason brought up earlier with the kind of stagnant number of law enforcement officers, does that show up anywhere in here or not really?
Yeah, so we have made assumptions for the number of new hires that are going to join the plan, essentially the growth of the system year over year. If that assumption, if there's risk, if that assumption is wrong, that could change these plan maturity metrics for sure.
cash flow ratio. Is that anything we should be worried about?
Yeah. So yeah, cash flow ratio. Yeah, Jacob's right. That's probably the most interesting one on here. So cash flow ratio, that is taking the benefits being paid out of the plan, dividing it by the contributions coming into the plan. So when that ratio is over 1, that means the plan is cash flow negative, meaning contributions coming in are less than benefits going out. And when we look at this chart, that cash flow ratio is increasing over time. And then in 2022, I don't have the actual number on here, but I went and looked at the underlying numbers for this chart. 2022 is the first year that Left 2 went cash flow negative. And that's not unique to Left 2. A lot of the other plans, a lot of the other open plans are in a similar boat. So what happens when a plan is cash flow negative? What additional risks show up? The one that shows up is liquidity risk. And that is the risk that a plan will have to sell assets, potentially at an inopportune time, in order to meet the benefit obligations of the plan. That risk is, then, if that risk occurs, it can impact the return on assets in a given year. It can impact the forward-looking rate of return assumption. Thankfully, that risk is low for Left 2 and low for the rest of the state retirement systems where we stand today. And that is because of how WSIB manages the assets. WSIB has been prepared for these plans to go cash flow negative for a really long time. We hand them output from our projection model every year. So they've known when these plans are going to go cash flow negative for a long time. So they are managing the assets for this situation. And while this might be a new situation for the open plans, they've had plenty of practice managing cash flow negative plans with the current closed plans, PERS 1, TERS 1, LEF 1. Those plans have been cash flow negative for quite a bit of time. So yeah, it's new that the plan is cash flow negative. It does open up liquidity risk, but from our perspective right now, we think liquidity risk is pretty small and pretty limited because of the excellent job that WSIB does managing the assets. Okay, the last one on here is the headcount ratio, the big green bars there, number of active members per annuitant. It tells the same story as all of these other ratios here. It's historical data, the plan has been maturing, and then in the projected data, that maturity slows and eventually stabilizes. Just 3 different ways to kind of get your head wrapped around plan maturity.
Yeah. The only questions I can think of probably are too big to have to spring on you. Just I probably because I'm speaking about the benefit improvement at NCPERS next week, so I just have that on my brain, and just thinking about in the future how the plan maturing and having more retirees than active members, and then when I go around the state and talk to members and they thank the board for passing the benefit enhancement and ask when the next one's coming. And then I get to be Debbie Downer on that. How this potentially just impacts the policies of the board in pursuing benefit enhancements when you have just that change in actives versus retirees. Not really a question for you, just more of a comment to the board, I guess, of the design of those benefit enhancements and how this impacts the cost of that and the policy and just the policy in general. As far as I know with the last benefit enhancement, there was a payment to retirees and a benefit improvement for actives, and you could see how that would be impacted by this moving forward.
Can I ask a couple of questions now? One of the things that was brought up is PTSD and some of the other things that goes through LNI. We're a pension board. We're not a pension disability board. So when it becomes a disability, it doesn't. The adverse effect on pensions is slim correct? Because it would be over on L&I for the disability, not the pension. If somebody goes off with less than 5 years, they just get their returns back. They don't end up with a pension. And if they are considered disabled, it's a disability with a reduced pension, correct? So, and if you go to left one, this sounds morbid, but I'm pretty sure everybody knows the ages of the left one members and when they're usually termed out is the nice way to put it. Is that figured into to the benefits on what they're going to have to pay out? Does that make sense? Understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think it's a question that
Like an
I've
insurance.
spoke with DRS a lot about just over the years of just the interest in who's qualifying for disability benefits, and then what the life expectancy of people who qualify for especially for catastrophic disability. You would assume that the life expectancy is going to be a lot less than someone who is a service retiree. And is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, firefighter, a police officer gets injured at 45. PTSD or can't return to work, especially under disability. It takes 2 or 3 years before that person is considered disabled and they're not collecting a pension. So once they become disabled and they're told they're disabled, they still can't collect their pension without a penalty until age 50, correct?
No, so
I mean,
there's a couple of things there, Pat. They do get a duty disability pension. So if somebody goes out at 40 because of PTSD, they can start drawing a pension at 40.
But is it a reduced pension?
Yeah, not for early retirement, but they only get the benefit of like
Years of service.
Yeah, if they had 5 years of service, 2% a year, they get a 10% pension. They're still getting it earlier than the actuary would have projected because normally they wouldn't be expected to qualify until at least 50. So there is a cost to the plan from duty disabilities when somebody goes out earlier than age 50.
Yeah, but let me finish up where I'm going.
Okay.
Way out here, coming down into here, because isn't that factored into after everybody that's going? There's a certain factor that says this is almost the people that go off on a disability with a pension. The cost of the plan is almost like a de minimis, kind of less than 2% of the overall annuitants to the pension plan. Is that tracked?
Yeah, if what you're asking is kind of the relative cost of disability relative to
The pension.
all of the other benefits, I looked at this a couple months ago. I believe over 90% of the active liability for Left 2, so the benefits due to active members, is held for expected retirements.
Okay.
So
That's
everything else, which is termination, anybody that leaves for any reason, and disability benefits and death benefits and OPEB benefits. So if for surviving spouses would gain access to PEB, and members with catastrophic disabilities would get their healthcare premiums reimbursed. That constitutes 9 to 10% of the liability. So you're right. Like the majority of the plan benefits are for expected retirements.
okay. And it sounds kind of morbid, but I know it's like, I hate to say it's like an insurance policy, and you get an annuity, you get life insurance. There's an expectation you're not going to get it because they're not willing to pay out if they don't have to. So, okay. And I guess that's where I'm going, is that's how all those things are figured into what we're doing here.
Yep.
And that's, to me, that is, there's no hidden bubble. We've got pretty much through what we know and what you guys know through an actuary on, if you just take the numbers, don't get into the personalities, the numbers are set.
Yeah. So we make assumptions for, the members that are going to get to retirement. There's some members that we project that are going to exit on disability benefits. Some of those benefits are going to be non-duty related. Some of them are going to be duty related. Some active members are going to pass away while in active service. Some of those deaths are going to be duty related. Some of them are not going to be duty related. And then, yeah, the granularity on the disability benefits goes pretty deep too. You have duty, you have non-duty, you have catastrophic, and then you have all of the resulting OPEB benefits that or health benefits, excuse me, that come off of that. We build all of that into our model, and we have assumptions for all of that stuff. I know because sometimes that is all. Those are the type of assumptions we are reviewing right now as part of our demographic experience study. And like I mentioned earlier to Mark's question, yeah, I think you argue with us sometimes because we're having to build a lot of these assumptions through expectations rather than experience, which is challenging when you say, okay, here's this new occupational disease. Tell me how many people are going to make a claim under that. Well, that's really hard with absolutely no data. Well, this is going to be one of the first experience studies where we're going to have a decade plus of data on that. So I am looking forward to tightening up those assumptions based on what we've seen.
Yeah, getting back to kind of an earlier point that you made, Jay, that piece of the pension liability that's related to disability retirements and other that Mitch spoke to, that's something we've been paying particular attention to over the last 18 to 24 months because there's been information or shared with us about a rising number of L&I claims related to PTSD. And at least what the data had shown so far was that hadn't led to an increase in disability retirements beyond what was expected. That may go back to the nature of PTSD being treatable. You'll remember there was a presentation to the board several years ago where that's PTSD is a treatable occupational illness. And so it may also go to the point, though, of the data being that Mitch just made about the data is fairly fresh on that. So this next experience study that you'll get next year and maybe even the one after that will help define more clearly how much effect PTSD is having on duty disability retirements and how that matches up with the expectations that were developed initially. Jay?
So just to put a bow on this, so I'll be interested to see what the new data shows because everything I see from my lens where I sit is workers' comp disability claims up, specifically for things like PTSD and on-the-job injuries are growing. There's a lot that cities are doing now to try to pay better attention to those types of things. And the overtime rates are up because of that. So there's a lot of people that are out on disability. And because of that, overtime rates are up. And so that's real right now. I see it in every one of my data points. And so there's work, again, cities need to do to be better at addressing those issues so that we can combat that and bring those claims down and take care of our people. But it's a real thing right now.
Now, I'm not quite sure if this is a segue to a new topic, but getting back to Mitch, your point about how actuaries define risk differently from, say, non-actuaries. One of the risks that the board has talked about going back to the benefit improvement bill is there was a part of that bill that's offset rate increases from the benefit improvement. And that rate offset expires in 15 years. So I don't know if that would necessarily be defined as an actuarial risk or using your term if that's more like a feature of the plan. But can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Because that'll be a challenge potentially for the board to manage, whatever 10, 12 years from now. Not sure how many of us in the room will still be here 10 or 12 years from now, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. You are correct that how an actuary would define risk, this assumed value versus actual plan experience, the offset expiring in 15 years wouldn't fall under an assumption. I'm not setting an assumption for when the offset expires. That happens. That's written into law according to a specific day. So just a reminder on what the offset is. The offset is part of the minimum rate funding policy that was added to RCW as part of the benefit improvement bill. It offsets the minimum rates for the first and second tier of the minimum rates. It was designed to reduce the minimum rates for current plan members when the benefit improvement bill passed, which means we calculated it such that it was set for a temporary time consistent with the future expected working lifetime of current plan members when that benefit improvement bill was passed. So therefore it has an expiration date. And when that expires, rates could pop up if the plan valuation is in that first or second tier of minimum rates. So yeah, as Steve said, not exactly an actuarial risk, but it could be a risk to the board's goal of stable contribution rates, because you're going along and then you have this offset expire and rates pop up. So not something you have to deal with today. This is a problem for 15 years in the future. So definitely not a Steve problem. But when we get closer there, we're able to consult on options for you on what you want to do around that to avoid that contribution rate stability, if that is not an acceptable outcome, having those contribution rates bump up. You could consider adjustments to the minimum rate policy. You could consider phasing up to that beforehand, knowing that expiration of the offset is coming. So it's out there. It could be a potential risk to the board's goals, but it's not something that you have to tackle in the near future. All right, talking about risks that you may have to deal with in the near future, here's a lot closer risks that could potentially impact the plan. So here I am taking us back to our projection of the member contribution rate, but here I am looking at two scenarios for investment risk. So I mentioned that for that baseline projection, we are assuming all future plan experiences matches the plan assumptions. The assumption for investment returns is 7%. All right, investment risk would say, okay, what if 7% isn't the actual return we get year over year? So in this scenario, I have two scenarios in the red line and the green line. Not surprising, red is the negative scenario, green is the positive scenario. I am increasing each year's investment return by 1%. So investments will return 8% a year or 6% a year. Now, we know even if investment return risk hits, that it's not going to be exactly 8% or exactly 6%, but you can view these as proxies, as if the average long-term experience was 8% or if the average long-term experience was 6%. And not surprising, if you have a lower investment return assumption, a 6% return occurred year over year, contribution rates would go up and follow the red line. The contribution rates would, instead of coming down for that 2028 valuation, would actually show an increase to about 9.25%. And then opposite is true if investment return experience is more positive than the current assumption. 8% follows the green line, would drop all the way down to about 8% by 2030.
And so once again, we're seeing the big jump, not just because of the 1% investment return, but how that impacts the funding ratio and then the steps that are in the funding policy.
Yes, exactly. That 9.25% is that funded ratio falling in that 100 to 105% first tier, and then the resulting rate being about 9.25%. So I wanted to show this to you, as it doesn't take a lot of different experience for the plan to go one way or the other in terms of 9.25% contribution rates coming out of the valuation, all the way down to 8% coming out of the valuation. So the next few years of plan experience is going to dictate which side we're going to go on here. And I will also just note I am isolating investment return risk here. As I said before, none of these things happen in isolation. If actual investment returns are 6%, there could be offsetting plan experience that negates that as well. From an actuary's perspective, it is helpful to isolate these risks to understand what their independent impact on the plan projection is, but we know in reality that's not how it works.
Is there often a correlation between if investments are down that you typically see other rates, or not just rates, but other risk follow it, or
yeah, sometimes things do work in correlation. I think if you think back to 2008, 2009, investments got smashed. Well, okay, salary freezes went into place, people lost raises, some people lost jobs. So yeah, there can be a correlation, especially in extreme scenarios. Not always though, and then sometimes the correlation is lagged. Like with inflation, we have inflation higher than expected. It takes a couple years for salary gains consistent with that inflation to flow through the system. So that's sort of a long way of saying sometimes not, sometimes it's lagged. It's hard to know. The economy is messy, and there's a lot of things that go into plan experience, and it's sometimes hard to draw direct straight lines between one piece of plan experience impacting another. So I do have another scenario here. This one is looking at economic risk. So before we even look at the chart, let me try to explain what scenarios I came up with here. So here I'm looking at that salary growth or salary gain assumption. And I am changing that assumption by plus 2% or minus 2%. And I'm putting that for a temporary period. I'm just doing it for 4 years. For the investment return one, I drug it out for forever because you could have investments average 6 or 8 kind of over the long term. I didn't have any information to indicate that our long-term assumption for salary growth is wrong over the long term. So I wanted to focus on short-term experience here. So just a 4-year period, plus 2% to the assumption or minus 2% to the assumption. Does that make sense, what I did?
Yes. This is where I asked him questions when he first showed this to me, and now he's answered all my questions.
Okay. Just a little bit more background to help you interpret the plus and minus 2%. Across all of LEF 2, for its active members, we assume salaries are going to grow by roughly 5.5% per year. All right, so 5.5%. So these scenarios would be 7.5% or 3.5%. And then as another handle, another point of reference, 2022 and 2023, the last two valuations, those had salary gains of about 10% each of those 2 years. So we assumed 5.5%, actual salary was about 10%, and that happened 2 years consecutively. So that is about a 4.5% difference from the assumed return. So here I'm taking, okay, what if about half of what we saw the last 2 years happens, but it happens for a 4-year period. So half of the gain, but it happens for a little bit longer. I did plus 2 and minus 2. I have no insights into where salary is headed, definitely not in the short term. I'm sure all of you have a better idea than I do. I did plus 2 because we saw recent salary gains to be a little bit higher than the current assumption. I also did minus 2 because I think you could make the case that there's been this period of high salary gains. There could be a period of lower salary gains, and then our assumption is sort of evened out in the long term. But that's what I'm showing in these two scenarios. And then getting to the results, not surprising, follows just like the investment return scenario, where if salary growth is larger than we assume by 2%, it would follow the red line and it would kick the plan into that 100 to 105% tier of minimum rates. And then if it is lower than we expect, it follows the green line, which is pretty close to our baseline projection through 2029, and then drops down a little lower further out. You may notice the scenario numbers, the 9.19, 8.12, not exactly the same numbers as we saw on the investment return side. Those rates are a function of salary. When salaries change, those rates shift around a little bit as well. So it's not an error.
Recall just how close the 2% put to hitting that rate jump?
Which line?
Add one, the red one. Just it was the 2% salary growth. Did that just tip over the funding ratio to the higher tier, or?
Yeah, good question. I don't have the numbers handy right now. Yeah, I believe it was in the 103, 104% area. I'll also point out that how this projection model works. I assume that the projection model works by assuming the 9.19 is going to be collected for that 4-year period. So when those contributions go up, the funded status also goes up too. So you do see it come back down, but that come back down is contingent on that higher rate being collected. If just 853 was just gone right through the middle, I'm not sure if it would come back down or not. That would change the analysis that I did. But if this sort of experience starts to emerge, this is the sort of stuff we would bring to you, these sort of updated projections as the experience emerges, so you can figure out what you want to do with contribution rates.
Yeah, so just like this year, if the up and down, and you wouldn't expect, even if salary growth is higher for another couple of years, you would not necessarily expect it to continue on that trajectory. So the board, in adopting funding rates, would be able to see those long-term projections and make a decision about whether it's necessary or not to raise rates all the way up to 9.19 or other options.
Absolutely. Consider some sort of phased approach like you adopted recently. Yeah, I mean, just anything under the sun would be under your purview. Okay. Last thing I have, Steve already talked about it, the left 2 rate offset. This is a long-term rate projection, just showing you when that offset, that minimum rate offset comes up, what the bump in contribution rates is. I will preface this right off the top. I am not a fan of long-term rate projections. It is challenging enough to come up with rate projections 2 and 4 years, 6 years in the future, let alone 15 years in the future. So I want you to take these long-term rate projections with a giant grain of salt, because I can virtually guarantee you all the way out in 2038, the rate will not be exactly 9.15%. But the point C was making, and the point we talked about earlier, still stands, that the offset is a temporary reduction in the minimum rates. It does come off in 2030. It is a step increase in contribution rates at that point.
But it's not because of the funding ratio would not drop, or would not be the cause of this, the change in the funding ratio. Would the funding ratio remain the same, and it would just be that would the funding ratio remain the same through this? It's not causing the rate increase.
Correct. Yep. Just like we saw on that very first slide when it reached 108% and then it was going to stay right about there. That stays like that in the long term. The rate bump that we're seeing in this long-term rate projection is purely a product of the funding policy and the temporary nature of that offset rate. So just wanted to show this to you, show it to you, it exists, but also not something that the board has to deal with in the short term, because it's a little ways out there.
And so, not to get into it too much, but the board would be, if everything played out like this, yeah, exactly like you're predicting, the board would be overfunding the plan if they were paying the 9.15%. I mean, overfunding, I know they'd be following the rate funding policy, so you probably wouldn't use the word overfunding.
Yeah, I would need to look a little closer when we get out there. But yeah, it according to our projections, it didn't look like the increase in contributions was necessary to maintain the funded status of the plan.
Actuarial perspective is really unique because in essence, you are a full-time forecaster, right? In a way, and yet you're also disavowing the accuracy of your own forecast.
Yeah.
Okay? So now the reason I'm sort of highlighting those two statements is because I read a really interesting book recently where they talked about a section of a book. They talked about if you really want accurate forecasting, never talk to the experts in a field, okay, like in AI, because they'll tell you AI like 5 years from now is going to control everything, and right, it's going to be this area of super growth, blah blah blah, because they're just too close to it. They see it, right? So, is there a risk here as well that a pension expert, okay, like like in essence, that their judgment vis-a-vis the forecasting, or do you feel, or do actuaries, when we look at these projections, how confident, I guess, are you in your own projections? And does the fact that you are an expert and do this full time, is that also a risk? Does that make any sense?
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of good stuff there. Yeah. I would say I'm coming on the other side of it compared to those experts, because like you said, I'm kind of undercutting the value of some of these projections instead of holding them up as something that you should exactly follow. Yeah, so what I will say is that when we do closed valuations, when we do these annual rate setting valuations, all of these assumptions that we develop in those rate setting valuations are specifically designed for modeling the current population, coming up with the costs today that you should adopt that are going to be used for a 2-year period. When we grab these projections, we're taking those same assumptions and now we're dragging them over the long term, as well as making a whole bunch of other assumptions about new members that are coming into the plan. We are using those assumptions for a slightly different purpose than that they were initially designed, which that is what gives me some of the angst about saying, yep, you should look at these projections and absolutely rely on them for their long-term accuracy, because I think that we all know how volatile actual plan experience can be year over year. And I think that's the piece, is the year over year accuracy is what I don't believe in, but I believe in the long-term accuracy. So if you were to only consider a long-term average projection, I'd say, yeah, this is great. But if you want to look at precise 2038, 9.15, that's where I think the accuracy of these projections come down, if that makes sense. And so a lot of what we do is to show these projections, because I don't believe they're not valuable. I absolutely believe they're valuable. I think it's good to look at where the plan is headed on these baseline projections, but I consistently caution on getting too attached to specific numbers in these projections, because I do know that even if you're correct over the long term, the short-term volatility can make those short-term projections or those exact year-over-year projections inaccurate.
Thank you, guys. I hope this has been a peek behind. We meet with the actuary, Mitch and Lisa, at least monthly, Jacob and I and others. And I hope this has been informative for you to see kind of firsthand the types of conversations that we have as we're preparing the data and the actuaries are preparing their presentations for you. Thank you both very much for getting out of your comfort zone and having this conversation for the board today. I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good job.
Oh, we're going to change the agenda up slightly. We're going to go ahead and take a break now. and get the room reset. And once the break is over, it'll be, say 15 minutes. At 11:05, we'll come back and we will do the succession planning follow-up at that time. And we'll move the board member expectation presentation to following the succession planning follow-up. With that, I'll give you guys a 15-minute break.
And so when you're placing the jobs in these structures, especially for the two employees who have the same job title or working the similar duties, you want to make sure that any placement in the salary structure that differentiates them, that you have a system or one of these factors to differentiate the pay according to the equal pay law. So going back to this slide, any questions on the structure placement for the employees? No.
I'm not sure what we're asking here. I'm looking at the definitions for minimum, midpoint, and maximum, and then we make the determination where they should land. Is that what is that what it's saying?
Yeah, the board will make the determination of where the employees are placed in the salary structure.
So, and under the equal pay provision within Washington State, we've got OFM, we've got at the actuary's office, we got some other ones that match. There's some matching between what they are with DRS and this board. Should we have those salaries in front of us when we're trying to match where these should go for the equal pay side?
An interesting question, because I'm not sure if the law counts the agencies as different employers or if the state would be their employer.
Okay, but we can make that determination. Jay?
I don't think that the pay equity has to mean that all the directors of all the agencies are paid exactly the same.
Okay.
I think it's when you look at the qualifications and experience of what's needed for this job as compared to the market analysis that's done for other like positions like this. All it really means is that if you had two individuals doing the same work within the same, if there are two executive directors, unless there's a reason why they'd be paid different, they wouldn't be.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I have a question, but I don't know if you might not know the answer, but you might know the answer, Steve, is with OFM in the state of Washington, when we've, as a board, made determinations for salary levels, they have what's called bands. And bands seem to be like lock points. Did you come across that in the information from OFM by chance?
In their pay bands for the jobs? I'm not sure if what we looked at were considered pay bands or regions, or ranges for them.
What
Troop looked at is like positions and the pay that those like positions are getting, including OFM. You're right. OFM, a lot of those positions are limited by bands.
Right.
That was part of the reason for the bill, is that our positions, the 3 positions, were also limited by bands. If some of those OFM positions or some of those like positions were not limited by bands, would they possibly be higher? Maybe. But that data for like positions is what Troop used for this study. There wasn't any piece about like recommending doing away with the bands or anything like that. So and some of the other positions, like the legislative positions, don't have that same WMS banding. That to the extent that might affect the data, I don't know that it affects it in any kind of so significantly that you couldn't rely on it.
Gotcha.
And Jason, if you're talking about the WMS bands, we didn't look at those. Those are so wide, it's hard to determine any sort of comparability.
Right.
If you're talking about the WMS, what Washington Management Service bands.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's what you were getting at, was we'd had presentations previously about WMS. Those bands hadn't been adjusted in 30 years. What this was focused on was more the comparable work, the comparable positions, which those are exempt from civil service. So they're not under those band guidelines, and Cameron is right. Those bands are, I think the width of those bands is like 130%. That's what's kind of allowed some tolerance of 30 years of zero maintenance, so that everybody's kind of up against the max of those. So the positions that were comparable in the state database were exempt positions.
Okay.
OFM doesn't even have WMS positions at all.
So,
Thank you.
Jason, I appreciate some of that. So what we're looking at, I got to remember where I was going with this. Because of the legislation that's been passed, we now have the ability to set the rates, to set the pay for the executive director, the deputy director, and the 2 other positions. So we are not limited by bands. We're not limited by anything except common sense and reality.
And you're limited by the statute that says that it has to be market-based structure. You're also, this is going to be the next part of the presentation, where we're going to talk about, there's a requirement to consult with the director of the Office of Financial Management, and also provide some advance notice to the chairs of the fiscal committees.
I understand.
So there's yes.
But it's consulting with OFM.
And so this portion of the data collection is to get that market-driven piece checked in the statute.
And that's this.
To provide kind of the swim lane, if you will, of what the market is saying, and then the board within that swim lane can decide where they place the positions.
Do we have a definition on consult?
Karen's going to talk about that here a little bit later. Okay. So we'll let Cameron kind of.
Okay, I'll wait.
Great. And so just an example of placing a job into the salary structure is that you would look at the skills and education and experience required of the job, and use that to determine fully qualified in that midpoint ahead of time before you consider the employees. And then you can assess whether or not within that range you have the flexibility between that midpoint and the maximum where to put them based on the education and experience. But you'd also want to make sure that the width is wide enough so that you have the opportunity to also give them room to grow. I wouldn't recommend ever placing anyone right on the maximum of the structure, because they won't have any room to grow in the structure. The structure is wide enough to allow for that room to grow. If you have someone who just couldn't be beat in their years of experience in education, I mean, and you really want to do it, that's on your purview. But my recommendation wouldn't be to peg anybody at the top. And also, when you place employees in the pay structure, it's best practice not to decrease any salaries. It's best practice, any structure development that you do, even if they were paid way above the pay range, you generally, what we call, red circle them. Yeah. And then in wrap up, in light of the WMS structure not having maintenance for a number of years, it's important to keep the pay structure up to date. The structure right now is based on the market data as of August of 2024. And so those midpoints are fixed, are close to the market now. But a year from now, the market's going to move. And if your structure doesn't move with the market, they're going to be, every year it's going to slide. And eventually that maximum is going to be where you end up placing all the employees, because the market's going to move, the pressure is going to move. But if your structure doesn't move, then the jobs, then your structure is going to become obsolete. So I typically recommend organizations increase their pay structure annually, at least by a market movement. You don't necessarily have to do a market study. This could be the COLA that you increase it by. But in general, you want to make sure that that's tied to a market position. Historically, that's been 3%. When you look back 20 plus years, the last few years have been volatile, but historically it's 20%. Historically it's 3%. In the 80s, it was 20%. And then every 2 years, taking a look back at the market of the jobs themselves, because sometimes some markets of jobs move faster than others, depending on what's gone on in the market and the push and pull on the resources with it. And that's all I have for you all today. Questions?
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. On the pay structure recommendations, are they exactly to average, or are they some percentage above average? So for example, on the current class and comp study that we're undertaking, I've asked our class and comp consultant to give me a pay structure that's 5% above average as a recommendation, so that we're not immediately behind the minute we set the pay. So I'm just curious what you might have used as inputs to this to give us a recommendation.
So this pay structure is effective as of August of this year. And so if it doesn't go into play for another year, it would be helpful to age it already. If this goes into play a year from now, I would definitely increase the structure based on anticipated market movement over the next year. Mm-hmm. Good question.
Thanks. So yeah, I think that was kind of gets to my point. Usually, we look at a 2-year budget cycle at the state level. It's kind of nice if this type of program would align with that, and so we would probably bring our recommendation after consulting and doing all things to, the budget cycle, which would then be enacted, usually July 1st of the following year, and usually it's like a 2-year cycle. So I just didn't know how that would play, or how you recommend that we work within that structure.
I think we'll get into that in the next part of the presentation, which is more like long-term process versus a short-term process.
Yeah, we broke this up there's no action today. I should have mentioned that. There'll be a follow-up on this in November for you guys to discuss next steps. But there's the initial, if you will, any initial adjustments, and then there's the development of a long-term ongoing process. What Cameron was speaking to, Jay, what you're speaking to is that part of that annual process would be adjusting this range every year based on the COLA or some other number, so that the range doesn't immediately become out of date. So if you adopt the long-term process, or you adopt this range as part of a long-term process a year from now or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily be using these exact numbers. They might be adjusted based on what's happened between now or August and the date that you adopt your long-term policy. Does that make sense? In the meantime, we'll also talk about sort of the initial piece of it is what, if anything, you want or plan to do prior to the changes in the long-term structure.
This comment isn't about this. I think I've been on record about the WMS bands. I don't work for the state, I work for a city. But as we look at the rest of the staff that work for the left board, if this analysis and how it looks at those positions isn't a big red flag for how out of date the WMS bands are, I don't know what else is. I think the state of Washington really needs to take a look at those bands and really needs to do a deeper dive because you lose good people when you don't pay market. You can't recruit good people when you don't pay market. And so it's just a shame when you see really talented people don't hang around because they get an opportunity to make a little bit more money. And we all love our jobs, but at the end of the day, we have to feed our families and we have to take care of people, right? So I just, again, it's not relative here. We don't have any control over that, but I just have to make the comment for the record.
Well, there's one person here who has some control over the other positions, and that's me, Jay. And I thank you because I did ask Troop, and as part of the contract, I did get market data for the other positions here as well to help me in setting salary for those positions. And philosophically, we are right in alignment. I think we've got a fantastic team, and that's one of the you'll get a spoiler alert. You'll get the satisfaction survey or the board expectation survey results later. But I think the quality of the team is a direct input into the scores that we see from the satisfaction of the board members.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
All right. So following up with the second piece of the team salary setting analysis and getting at some of the questions that you guys had, is Karen. In addition, again, we'll have follow-up in November, but Karen will also be kind of the point person, not kind of, she will be the point person for the board in terms of the adoption of a long-term policy for how you guys evaluate and set salaries in the future. But as sort of the lead in to this process, I'll turn it over to you, Karen, to talk about some of the next steps.
Thank you, Steve. Vice Chair, members of the board, Karen Durant, staff to the board. Just for clarification on the WMS bands too, the bands are so wide that they're not meant specifically if you're evaluated at a band 1 or a band 2 to have the full capacity of that band. There should be ranges of consideration within the broad bands. So just a point of clarification there. So as a reminder, Pat segued us a little bit early. We have conditions that were presented in the bill that we need to comply with. When setting salaries, the board must consider comparable public sector positions using market-driven data. So after this presentation, I think that's complete. You've seen what the market has to offer. The second is the consultation piece with the Director of the Office of Financial Management. After this meeting, and you've all seen the market data, there will be a letter going to the director of OFM along with the market study asking if they would like to consult, saying that the board is looking at the ranges. So the consulting would be particularly on the swim lane, if you will. And the letter also specifies that if we don't hear back on a consultation process, the board could move for action in November. The last piece is the board shall provide notice to the chairs of the fiscal committees of proposed changes, so that notification would need to go prior to any effective date of those increases. Yes.
I want to just ask Pat's question again, the definition of consultation. So the consultation was with OFM, and maybe you don't know the answer to this, Karen, but does that mean that OFM has the ability to say no and push back, or just the ability just to have a conversation with us to make sure they're part of the negotiation? I just want to make sure I understand what that means for that next step.
I think we're going to be testing that, but I don't think it means it's a veto. I don't think it means anything like that. I think the data speaks for itself. That's what they're going to be most interested in focusing on. Consult may mean in this case, I see you have your ducks in a row. You've hired an independent consultant. The data looks good, and we're fine. And in that case, you know, they probably just wouldn't even reach out. But again, we've not tested this. The statute for Steve's position also has that consultation piece in it. We've never tested that or used it. So I think what they're going to be most interested in is having that data-driven approach that they can see there was effort gone in, they can see the detailed pieces.
Yeah, I had discussions with legislators and legislative staff about what was meant by consult, because that was added in an amendment during the legislative process on the bill. And again, their understanding of that was in line with what Karen just lined up. And we'll see if the director of OFM has that same interpretation or not, but we'll move forward on that here as soon as this meeting's over.
Yeah, they're pretty busy putting together a budget and worrying about an election and putting together lots and lots of transition notebooks and documents. So this hits them at a busy time. So we'll see.
Sure.
So, I'm sorry.
This is either Steve or for you, but what we're saying is the troop study is going to go to the office of, to OFM with the numbers that they have that be presented to us.
Correct.
With the early, with the mid, okay. And those are the numbers that are going forward.
Okay. Well, it's up to the board to adopt those, but we're going to provide the market data to OFM,
okay.
The exact same information the board has seen today.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So next steps, the board will have to talk about process. What does ongoing look like for this? Per Cameron's presentation, it's going to need to have some kind of market refreshing approach. General wage increases are not enough to keep things up to date. So the board will have to decide, do you want a 2-year process where we're doing a market touch base? The easy thing to do, the board would be to say every time the legislature authorizes a general wage increase, the structure automatically increases by that. We do the market approach every 2 years. That's an example of what we would have. The other thing is next month we can have a possible executive session to have Steve present performance reviews for relevant staff. That can include the executive director's performance evaluation as well. Thank you all for getting your surveys back timely. I appreciate that a lot. In the meantime, we'll be doing that consultation piece, figuring out what that means with the director of the Office of Financial Management. Following up in November with options for process and the salary ranges, possible action November or December. So Representative Bergquist brought up an excellent point about the alignment of budget. We are a micro agency. We don't have the capacity to absorb large expenditures. The board is, however, a non-appropriated account. In conversations I've had with OFM, they felt like as long as we could get some numbers to them before possibly the governor's budget goes out, that they could put that in the Winsome system, which would then allow that to go through legislative process. So the board doesn't have an appropriation in the budget, but the expenditure authority, it's still budgeted. So we're tied to that. Any other questions? Winsome is the budget system. Yeah, but very budget speak. I'm sorry. 20 years at OFM, sorry. Goes into the IT system and allows it to go through the legislative process, yeah. But the board may want to consider an adjustment to the timing so that we could essentially do a formal decision package, that kind of thing moving forward. But because we are non-appropriated, there's a possibility for that to be a little less formal. Questions, comments?
Again, no action today, but this will obviously, we'll have a lot for you in November.
Thank you, Karen.
Yes.
I mentioned earlier that the succession planning was kind of broken up into 3, now 4 spots. The second part, Karen's also going to talk about, and that is our facilities. Karen, why don't you share where we're at on that?
Happy to. For the record again, Karen Durant, staff to the board. We are in the process of having an expiring lease. And I know this looks like a long time away, like Steve's retirement, but it's not. We need to plan and we need to go through the process. And in fact, we were behind in the process. We've been working with the Department of Enterprise Services Real Estate Services Division, as well as OFM Facilities Oversight. In that process, they determined that our best course of action would be a lease renewal. Just because of what's going on in the market, because there was no kind of option for tiny agencies to all be co-located. There wasn't anything like that stood up. In addition, we had such an incredible lease rate that when everybody looked at that, they just said, if we can do this with a minimal increase, it would be the best approach. So DES is currently in the process of negotiating the new lease with the landlord. At the time this was posted to the website, the landlord was our property. The land itself is owned by the Port of Olympia. And so the landlord was in the process of negotiating that land lease, which my understanding is sometimes those can drag out for 2 years. We have the landlord has a signed land lease. So we don't have any barriers to the execution of a new lease. So right now we are probably maybe 2 weeks away from having a signed lease for execution through 2031. It will be a 5-year lease. I don't know what it looks like beyond that. My guess is with whatever happens with long-term work from home, that kind of thing, there may be some other different options for co-location. We wanted to keep the board up to date, and as we have a final lease, we will let you know. Are there any questions, comments? No? Perfect.
Thank you. The third piece of succession planning that we talked about a year ago and that I wanted to give you an update on today is me as the executive director position. I think I told you all a year ago that I'll turn 65 in December of 2025. That hasn't changed. We all talked, all of you in my one-on-ones, we talked about succession planning. Many of you, we talked about me in particular. And so I wanted to take this one opportunity where we had all the board members at the same time so that you're all hearing the same thing at the same time. So with respect to me, right now I've got a lot of sick leave on the books, and if I don't need it between now and 2025, I could roll that over into Aviva to pay my medical, a quarter of it. I get cashed out at a quarter, but roll that over into Aviva to pay medical expenses for me and my family, which would theoretically then allow me to go out earlier than December of 2025. Definitely, though, no earlier than the end of that short session in 2026, I mean. So, yeah, so we've got, yeah, let me back up. So we've got session coming up in 2025, short session coming up again in 2026. Steve turned 65 in December of 2026. So the window, if you will, depending on how things go between now and then, would be probably in that 18 to 24 months from now. That's talked about that kind of roughly with all of you, but I wanted to get it out there one time to everybody. A couple of other things related to that that I talked about. One, I'm a run through the tape kind of a guy. So I don't plan on changing anything about what I'm doing or how I'm doing it until the day I'm not doing it anymore. And that kind of brought up a thing too. There were a number of you had questions about my potential interest in continuing to work in some capacity after retirement. And I think I was clear, but I'll make it clear here that the one thing that I will not do after I retire is work. So I've seen too many, I've got too many peers that I've seen, they come back to work as consulting or part-time or something along those lines, and they end up working full-time for less salary. And so my plan is to make a clean break when that day comes. What's that? Yeah, no.
Will you be changing your cell phone number?
Yeah, see, and there will be, I won't be changing my cell phone number. I might be changing who I answer my cell phone for. Obviously, I'm not going to leave you guys in the cold as far as, by you guys, I mean, whoever the next person is, I'll
continue to do what I can to support them, but I'll be doing it for free. So it's limited by that. You get what you pay for, if you will.
No Taco Bell.
The other piece about that that I did want to talk about is between now and then. Okay, I've been very open with you guys about giving Jacob every opportunity that I can in the meantime to help him prepare to be a candidate for that job. It told you a year ago, he's kind of on, look at it as an extended job interview with you guys. That's going to continue. I did talk with each of you specifically about your comfort level with that. And so we're moving forward with the mentoring. In my mind, the most significant project for the board as a whole, and for me to support you guys, is this transition over the next 18 to 24 months. So as important as rate setting, as important as legislation that you may or may not be recommending, getting this done right so that the goal is that whenever that transition happens, that there's no drop off in services to the board, to you guys. That's the goal. And I will need help from you and help from the team in order to achieve that goal over the next 18 to 24 months. And we'll be talking about that in more detail about over the next 18 to 20, this salary setting thing. Obviously, that's going to be a key piece of making sure that your services are not affected by any by future transition. And that brought up, all these one-on-one discussions brought up kind of the fourth point, which is board members. Many of you shared with me your own personal plans for the next 18 to 24 months or longer. And that is something that all of you need to talk about more as part of the succession planning now. There's going to be turnover amongst board members in the next 18 to 24 months. And depending on, so we're going to have new board members coming on that haven't had the benefit of these discussions, haven't had the kind of consideration about this transition that you guys already have had. It will be up to you to help educate them and bring them up to speed quickly. I don't want it's a challenge if, for instance, in a worst case scenario, we're doing all this work with you, and then in 24 months, there's 11 brand new, completely green faces that haven't been a part of this process at all that are making all the decisions. So both with, as board members talk with your organizations about who may or may not be the next person on the board, please make sure that this succession planning topic is one of the things that you talk about. And to the extent that each of you are considering your own tenure on the board, can take that into consideration as well. If you're thinking, well, I might retire or leave the board in somewhere between 20 and 28 months, I would say please pick 28, so that you're on the other side of that transition deadline. That would, I think, benefit the board greatly. So I wanted to throw that out there for you guys to consider now in the future as well. With that concludes sort of the update on the strategic planning of the succession planning, if you will. Be happy to answer any questions, though, that you might have. Jay?
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate how transparent you always are with everything and just making sure that we have everything we need and know what's coming. So just appreciate you for that. One of the in the succession planning, one of the best gifts that my predecessor gave me when I was the assistant city manager before he left is in his last year, when he knew it was his last year, he put me in his spot more often than he did before. So for example, I ran the budget process that he normally runs in his last year. He was over here, but I was in charge of it because I was going to own that budget after he retired, right? And then it gave me a chance for the council to see me working through a budget process, working through difficult things. He left for 6 weeks because he was using up all his vacation before he retired, right? And so I got to be in the chair for a longer period of time than I normally would in an interim. So I would encourage you to look for those kinds of opportunities for Jacob and other, and others, so we can see them in a different light than we see them now. Not that we don't see him exactly who he is, but the opportunity to see someone lead in a different way in your last year and with you side by side to mentor could be a really great opportunity. So I just want to encourage as much as that can happen.
Jay, you and I are right in alignment. And so let me just tell you and share this with all of you. The stakeholder groups, the police and fire stakeholder groups in particular, have been extraordinarily supportive as I've voiced this goal to them. And so Jacob has been taking my place, for lack of a better word, at WACOPS conferences, state council presentations, making presentations on board legislation to the legislature. The next piece of that, which some of you talked about directly, would be actually the board meetings themselves. I won't name names. A couple of you even suggested, hey, why don't you unexpectedly call in sick for a meeting so that Jacob has to fill in for you at the last minute? That I'm not going to do, but it is my intent that happen over the next year. And so that'll, just to give you a heads up. One of the one area where that is going to be a little bit the most challenging, I'll just say, is with some of the personal relationships that I have. So now we're not talking about organization to organization, but we might be talking about my relationship with a particular legislator, for instance. And that's the piece that won't be able to do as much. I can ask to say, hey, would you mind if I brought somebody to this meeting? And if they say yes, great. But if they say no, then that's the way it's going to be. And Jacob, again, you know, he worked for the Senate. He's got his own relationships with legislators as well. He'll continue to develop that over the next 18 to 24 months. But that is probably the only area where I see some potential where it won't be a complete. Everything else, I should say, is on the table. So heads up in your work plan for next year. That will be one of the things. Is I'll be seeing Jacob up here in this chair. Any other questions? Yep. If you want, this would be a good time then to take maybe just a 5-minute break, and then we can come back and kind of wrap up last two presentations before we adjourn. We'll be back here at 12:15. That's an 8-minute break. All right. It is 12:15 and I said we'd be back at 12:15. So we'll go ahead and resume, and then we'll have a couple of members join us as we go. So earlier, we had scheduled on the agenda the board member expectation process, kind of the results of the ongoing individual interviews that I had with each of you. I want to thank all of you for making time, taking the surveys ahead of time, and then making time to talk with me personally about your expectations and about the past year, how we did meeting your expectations in the past year, and how your expectations have or have not changed for the future. And those discussions were extraordinarily valuable. You heard the results of some of those discussions here in this last bit about the succession planning. But getting back to the original questions that were on the survey, Tim is here to kind of share with all of you the results, the cumulative results of all of those expectation interviews. And with that, Tim, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve. For the record, Tim Valencia, Deputy Director for the Board. This is the Board Member Expectation Results Review for 2024, as Steve just talked about. This is the process that the Board has been doing since 2012. I think Mark and Senator Holy were probably the only two trustees currently on the board that were actually involved in that process. And they may recall that this has been an evolving process over time, and that's what this is intended to be. So what you're going to hear from me today are on a couple of key points I'll put out here is that one, that the satisfaction numbers have remained very high. We'll have a little discussion about that. And having just mentioned this is the 13th iteration of this process, that this is a good opportunity when we get to the very end at the time for discussion to consider if there are some adjustments or changes to make to ensure that we have clarity and are meeting, fully meeting expectations. So you're going to look forward to that piece of the conversation, and I'll inform that as we go. So again, I've put this slide up before, and I have shortened this down significantly from past years where we've gotten really deep into some of the numbers, but these statements still continue to be true in this process. The expectation measurement process is something that corporations, use, globally in this. And so it's a very good process for determining ultimately whether or not there is a problem, because this is always measuring what somebody expects versus what reality they actually face. And if you have a difference between expectation and reality, that's the fundamental definition of a problem. So that's what we're always looking for, is making sure we don't have any gaps. But to be able to make sure we don't have any gaps, we have to actually understand the expectations so we can meet those expectations. If I don't know what those are, I can't help meet those expectations. For us as a team working for you, we need to make sure that we know what that expectation is so we can meet or exceed that expectation. So we're always looking for clarity. We're always looking for ways to get that information out of you. So that's part of the process even today. It's part of the ongoing process with the expectation surveys, with the individual meetings with Steve. Those are all part of this feedback loop and gives us the opportunity to pivot and adjust. I think for me, where this leads to is that, one, it does lead to direction for the team, these discussions. Many of the features that we have and many of the things that we do as a team have come out of direction from an expectation. And also that allows us to be dynamic. It allows us to adapt and respond to change as we're moving forward. So it's always a constant feedback process, and we're always seeking to make sure we understand what you're expecting. So I will review. We have 7 core expectation statements: responsibly govern the plan, support our policy decisions, assist us in making responsible decisions, help us get up to speed as soon as possible, educate the plan stakeholders, keep us informed, and provide professional administrative support. Now, those are I'll classify them as generalized statements or expectations. And just as a review, these statements are what I'll call summary level statements of expectations. They're driven by the feedback that we initially got when we went through the process of collecting information and expectations from trustees in 2012. We did further clarification work in some workshops in 2013, and ultimately sized all of the data and comments that we collected from individuals, and we're able to summarize them into these buckets, if you will. That being said, something to keep in mind is that when I look at each of these, because of my history with the system and those processes, these have certain meaning to me in terms of what I think, fits in this bucket. Probably each individual trustee, when they look at that based on what they may have going on, their circumstance, certain things, and recently, they're going to have certain things that they believe in that bucket. So there is a possibility for things to start to get misaligned. And so that's where we're always looking again to get back into alignment. So that's one of the things when we get into discussion that I do want to talk about today. So we'll move forward that. But before we do that, let's first look at the numbers for this year. As I said, what you'll see is that the numbers were still, the satisfaction levels were still very high this year. We appreciate that feedback. You see that this number 4.94, that's an overall aggregate of the responses to all 7 questions. So if you averaged the response for each question, it ends up at 4.94, which is, again, last year was the highest number we'd ever achieved at 4.97. So this is, microscopic difference. But again, the number still remains very, very high. And just as a reminder, the scale on this, 1 being at the low end means not satisfied at all. 5 on the high end means extremely or completely satisfied. Something to keep in mind that Steve and I had conversations about, this data and this information, and we said, well, what do these numbers, mean? And as we're looking at that, and for myself, I know when I'm looking at the scale, like for me, when I'm doing any kind of survey like this, for me, that center point is you're doing a good job, but you're not doing anything extraordinary, but you're not doing anything bad. You're just meeting the base. It's for me, that's you're meeting the expectation. To move it higher means you're doing more than meeting the expectation. There's something very good or even unexpected and extraordinary, maybe meeting a need that I didn't even actually know I had in that. So I know personally that's how I look at that. So I point that out just to bear in mind as this is a small sample group. We did have 11 responses this year. But everybody may approach these numbers very, very differently. I know I've talked to some people that go, and not necessarily in this room, but in surveys in general, there's some people go, oh, I never give the top score. I just don't do that. And so the numbers are sensitive. So to the point of the fact that we're scoring this high, though, is a nod to the team and the work that they're doing. Certainly, unless somebody feels differently, I don't think that shows in the scores. All the comments were very complimentary and all the scores were very high. So let's look a little bit more, and I did one point. This is the satisfaction, like I said, all the way back to 2012. As you can see, where it did start low, and then we responded to that, moved the numbers up as I've shown in the past. But we've been able to maintain a very high, fairly consistent level of scoring over time. And part of the reason I think that's significant and why this process is so important, as Steve was just talking about, succession planning over time. The thing to remember in this is that over this time, we've had several different team members involved in the process. We've had completely different trustees involved. So there's consistency in this process and these numbers borne by the success of the work that the team's doing and the work that the board's doing and making sure we know what the board needs. So that's how we're really looking. When I'm looking at these numbers, I'm going, are we maintaining the board itself? In addition to, are we meeting the needs of the people that are on the board right now? So let's look at this year specifically. These are the scores from 2024. As you can see, several categories we did hit 5, 4.9, 4.8, all exceptionally high scores, and certainly commend the team for the work that we're doing, and I appreciate that you guys have rewarded that with very good scoring. When I really started looking at the number by a long-term comparison, we did have 2 scores that were lower this year than last year, and that's one of the things I'm always watching for. I know these numbers are very sensitive. one person making something a 4 versus a 3 does cause a total number to score, because it's just how the numbers work. But that's something I'll look at just to make sure, do we have, potentially a problem or potentially an issue, or is there something of concern that happened that caused something to do that? Sometimes when we look at that, it's just going, yeah, I don't remember what I scored last year, and that's just the number for whatever reason I put. It might be lower. In some cases, we had a change in trustee, so the previous trustee scored it differently than the current trustee. Sometimes we find it changes based on the experience level of the trustee. The thing that I'm more concerned about is, one, do you have a significant change, which recognizes the problem, but two, I'm always looking at changes to go or patterns of answering to say, do we understand the expectation clearly? As I said, when I look at these expectations, they mean certain things to me. But if they mean something different to one of the individuals, I may not be meeting their expectations. So I'll give you a case in point. One of the scores that wasn't lower was help us get up to speed as soon as possible. That score is a 5, which looks great. But when I look at the data, we actually this year had 4 trustees who didn't answer that response, which has happened in the past. And when I've asked the question, as I did this year, usually what I find out is that the way they interpret that is just for new trustees, help us get us up to speed as soon as possible. And I admit that is where that started in 2012. In 2013, though, the addition into that expectation, which is part of what I incorporate, is not only just new trustees, but for an experienced trustee, are we helping you get to speed when there are new issues emerging? And are you getting the timely information? And when we have topics, are you getting the information that you need at the speed at which you need it? So there's multiple different things that I look at that. And so clearly, when I have trustees not replying to that one, well, that means there may be there may be a miss in terms of the clarity of that particular expectations. So those are the things that I'm looking at. Is there something material there versus is it just one of these systematic changes because of differences in a trustee's scoring? I know at times, I know some of I've come and asked saying, hey, I want to make sure there was a change. Part of the reason when Steve goes to the individual expectations, I send him with last year's scores and this year's scores, because we're looking at the patterns and we want to be able to have that conversation of, was it just one of these scoring issues, or is there a real issue underneath it? But again, I think this year that the thing that I'm very proud of this team for is that we had a lot of changes in the organization. We have new staff on the team, and we changed a lot of duties within the organization itself. So we were able to maintain a very high level of service for you while having a lot of changes within the organization, which represents a potential opportunity for things to have become missed. And I no doubt if we were missing, you guys would have let us know. So I think I'm very happy that this shows a high level of satisfaction. So my last slide, and normally the opportunity for discussion, and this year I called it next steps, and here's why. So the first 3 bullet points are the ones are my standards out there that, absolutely, as I've already said, clarity on the expectations is absolute key to success for us, and we're always looking for, are there, what new, what improvements do we need to exceed your expectation? Are there things out there that we're not doing that we should be doing? Have expectations changed? That's a little bit more of a global discussion. Are there new expectations that have merged? Is there something that's going on where one of these 7 statements, something doesn't really fit in that bucket? And if it's something that's fitting in one of those buckets, do we know about that? So I posed the question, are there things we should look at differently for 2025? I think about how we started this process that was, over a decade ago. We did a process to collect, and then we did a bunch of workshops to talk about and to find the clarity even further. We have some documents from back in 2012 that said, here's what expectation was, and it has a list of several different summary bullet points of the kinds of things that, helping us get up to speed means, or supporting our decision process. There is some of that history in there. So would there be interest, or do you feel that there's a need to do some work on that. Is this something you'd be interested in bringing back in 2025 on the interim plan and having a workshop to talk about, what the expectations mean to make sure that we're still meeting all the expectations, sure that we have them clearly or reasonably defined. So that's one, opportunity. Or within the process itself, there's the survey process, there's the interview process, which has been, from all reports, has been working really well. Are there things in that process, maybe instead of, you don't feel like we want to go further into a workshop, are there changes we could make in there? Can I provide supplemental information about the expectations? As I said, there's been kind of some historical definitions. Do we need to word the questions a little bit differently? I think about the get us up to speed question, where I'm just saying, are we meeting this expectation? But do I need to make clarifications about if you're new or versus if you're, a veteran trustee? So can we expand those questions? Those are things I'm putting forward for you to consider, to discuss. Again, we're always looking to find ways to make this process better and make sure that it ensures that we're meeting, defining and meeting your expectations. So with that, I will end my comments and open it up for a discussion.
Again, it's not an action item, but one of the things then that the plan would be to ask you the question next year when we're doing the interim work plan. Do you want a workshop, a refresher on this process where we could talk about any changes that you feel might be beneficial to the process? So heads up, as far as your strategic planning goes, that's one of the things that you'll have to decide next year. 2 key points. Tim touched on this with respect to succession planning. I said earlier, our goal is that the succession planning does not result in a decrease in the services to you. This tool is how we'll be, one of the tools, and how we'll be looking at that. And the second key point that I wanted to echo is we did this part of getting prepared for the future. We hired some people into some new positions. Jessica got a new job, had training, when Jessica's replacement then needed training, and the replacement for Jessica's replacement needed hiring and training. And yet, with all of that going on in the past year, the team still delivered an exceptional level of service to all of you. So I didn't want Tim hit on it, but I wanted to echo my gratitude to all of them for the work that it took this year in particular for those scores to remain at the level that they did. All right. With that, we've got a couple of more items that we need to cover before the meeting wraps up. Next up on the agenda is the proposed meeting calendar for 2025. I'll let Chloe will be here to present that. We've got one of the things for today is you've got just about everybody in the agency presenting to you. Chloe's been working with each of all of the stakeholder groups and with OFM, or with SIB, I should say, to kind of figure out where the conflicts are, where the availabilities are. And Chloe, I'll let you tell the board what things look like for next year.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Vice Chair Granneman and members of the board. My name is Chloe Drosby, and I'm the Executive Assistant. This will be a very quick presentation. The LEF board generally meets on the 4th Wednesday of each month. However, exceptions can be made for stakeholder outreach, fiduciary education, and holidays. I have done my best to avoid any of these large stakeholder events, educational conferences, but please take a look at your calendar and let me know if I've missed anything, and let me know. I did include printouts of these calendars in your materials. So if you have a hard time seeing them on the board, please take a look. There will be no action taken today, but at the November 20th board meeting, the board will adopt a final meeting calendar for 2025. And if there's any questions, I can take those now. And if you have time to look at your calendar and find something I've missed, please let me know.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you.
Okay. Another item on your work plan for us every year is videos. The final kind of presentation that we have for you is the video for this year. Now, as I understand, we've got even popcorn available for this. Chloe's going to come around and give you guys a chance to get some popcorn before the video gets started. This video is different in a couple of different ways from anything that we have done for you guys in the past. I'll let Jesse, one of the things is Jesse's been heading up the video development process as part of her new duties for this year. And then the style of the video, the content of the video is also a little bit different. And I'll let Jessie tell you about that as she introduces this new video for you.
Thank you. Jessie Jackson, Administrative Services Manager. In this new role, I am managing the communications program, and I've been learning how to make videos, creating them and editing them. This first one I've made is a little different. Like Steve said, it's not our typical question and answer type video. It is a talking head video or a spokesperson video. We learned of a surviving spouse who was nice enough to film for us and share a little bit about her story and help create this funnel type video, directing people to the Ombuds team if they have any questions or need assistance. This is a short video. It's going to be posted as a YouTube short, which is 1 minute long. So if you're going to eat the popcorn, you need to start now. And I'm going to go ahead and play it.
My name is Kalina, and my husband, firefighter paramedic Eric Schaus, passed away in 2018 due to an occupational disease. Firefighters have a disproportionately higher rate for cancers and heart disease. These diseases are referred to as presumptive diseases for first responders. If you or your loved one has been diagnosed with a cancer or a cardiac issue, current presumptive qualification is not the only criteria for filing an L&I claim. I want part of Eric's legacy to include making this path easier by sharing what I've learned. It is imperative that we understand the process and know where to access accurate information. Please contact the Left to Ombudsman's office, share your story, ask questions, and most importantly, get accurate information. They can be contacted at ombuds@left.wa.gov.
And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I want to thank Kalina for agreeing to do that, sharing both her personal story and being willing to be a spokesperson for the Ombudsman Office. We already have a video out there about the Ombudsman Office and what they do. This is more a video like a spokesperson directing them to the office. And then also Jesse doing the work to work with Kalina on getting this filmed and then doing all of the editing to prepare the video as well. The other thing that Jesse has done, and we'll talk about this more next year, but analyzing the traffic that we were getting on the existing videos and to where it was not meeting what our expectations or hopes were. Jesse's got a lot of experience with this kind of YouTube so going back and adjusting the tags on the video, the comment, those kind of things to hopefully increase the traffic to the existing videos as well. Kudos and thank you. And then we'll probably have some additional Q&A videos in the future. But one of the things that I hope this opened up to you guys is the idea of having educational videos in the sense of like maybe one on retirement planning, on the importance of retirement planning, and to the extent that we can use real people as spokespersons to kind of humanize, if you will, the messages that we're trying to deliver. So, Jesse, thank you. Kalina, thank you. Jay?
So Jesse, so my oldest son does video editing, video production for the Carolina Panthers. And I get to watch a lot of his stuff and what he does. And I know what it takes to go through and edit and do all the editing work. So just a really great job.
Thank you. It's definitely a lot of clicks, and it's my carpal tunnel is not really liking this, but it's really fun for me, and I've loved learning how to do it.
Carol? Yeah.
The video is to start off your outreach to the stakeholder groups.
Depending on the groups, the ability to play a video is not universal. We have in the past, when we talked with groups like, say, WACOPS, mentioned that there's a new video out there describing the Ombudsman program. Tammy did a presentation a while back about the Ombudsman program, and the video was a part of that as well. So I don't know that we've actually played them as often as we've told people about them being out there, and that may be one of the things that we need to change in order to drive more traffic to them, which will be a focus now in the future, is not just making the video and getting it out on the website, but what do we need to do to follow up with either stakeholder groups? For instance, Kalina's been working with the State Council of Firefighters on her husband's issue. What can we do to help drive traffic to our videos to get this message out to more people? That'll be built in the future. Daryl? Yeah.
I think the quick hitting, the 1 minute is helpful too, because you really focus on one issue, and maybe if we focus on some of the new legislation that's passed, so that people are aware, but not dragging it into a 10-minute presentation. It's 1 minute. This is the one item that we're doing, or even like the benefit enhancement, a 1 minute quick hit.
Yeah. We can direct them to a place where they can get more information if that's what they're looking for. But you hit on something. A 10-minute video is not going to get the kind of traffic that we're looking for. A 1 minute video might, and to the extent that it directs them to where they can get instead of trying to figure out all their questions and answer all their questions in one video, get them, in this case, we're trying to get them to the Ombudsman office, who can answer all the questions that they might have. It would take 2 hours to come up with all the questions and all the answers if we were going to try to do that. Yeah.
Carol, can you turn your mic on?
Which one?
Either one. Turn one of them on. There you go.
What I was going to suggest is maybe at least when you go to the stakeholder meetings, generally the people that are at the meeting get the information and they go back and it goes away. But I think everybody gets the left letter.
Yep.
Maybe and I don't know that I've ever seen it, but like a glossary in the very back. These are help videos for you if you have questions. Is it there?
QR code would be great.
Yeah, so it's something simple that if I'm sitting in my patrol car, I can just scan it and exactly bring it up and watch a video real quick.
Yeah, those are excellent suggestions. We do put that out on the website, but I don't know how much we've done in the newsletters in the past. But since the new newsletter person is also Jesse, your comments are right on point, Daryl. I saw her taking notes as you guys were sharing your ideas. Thank you.
I've had guys actually call me and go, is there a website I can go to learn about retirement? And I mean, seriously, it's difficult to feed them everything, but something like that might be a good path.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. I wanted to thank Kalina. I think, is Kalina on the call?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to thank her for sharing that story. And then he stole my thunder. So my suggestion was going to be the QR code.
Got it. It'll be the next newsletter.
Yeah.
What's that?
Exactly.
Okay. Let's see.
Just public comments.
Yeah. So the final thing that we had for you guys today is just a general announcement. The Left to Board welcomes public comment in advance of all the meetings and has posted instructions on its website for the submission of written comments. The staff did not receive any comments regarding this meeting. And so that it concludes the announcement on public comment. The next meeting is November 20th. We will, as you heard today, we'll be having a robust discussion on the implementation of the salary setting bill from last session. There'll be other items on the agenda as well, but that one in particular will be at the top of the list for you guys for action items. With that, Mr. Chair, that concludes all of the staff presentations for this meeting.
Motion to adjourn. They included. Thank you.